Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Weisner, and I teach at the Yale Law School. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Justice Cuéllar for the second of the Castle Lectures this year. I have to say it's been 23 years since Justice Cuéllar graduated the Yale Law School, and he looks exactly the same as he did when he was a bright, earnest, and when he was a bright and earnest and hardworking student. Yesterday, in her introduction of Justice Cuéllar, Professor Rosenbluth spoke of Justice Cuéllar's immigrant roots, his educational achievements, his government service, his teaching and scholarship as a professor of law at Stanford, and his appointment as the first Mexican immigrant to serve as a justice on the Supreme Court of California. Now, I think in the current political moment in which we're all suffering through, it's fair to wonder whether, had Justice Cuéllar been born 20 years later, whether he would be sitting on the Supreme Court of California with the current administration. In any event, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce him. Yesterday, he spoke of the politics and policy involved in addressing problems that, in his words, bedevil the modern world. Among other things, he spoke of climate change, nuclear weaponization, poverty, mass incarceration, especially of African American males. And he concluded by asking, where do we go from here? And he then had a very interesting discussion of the importance of social movements and political coalition building in addressing those problems. The lecture provoked a lively back and forth between Justice Cuéllar and primarily undergraduate economics, ethics, politics and economics majors about much of what he had talked about. I thought it was a very lively exchange between them, and it really showed me what a wonderful law professor he must have been, because he really encouraged disagreement and then engaged with it. I think we can anticipate that today's lecture and the follow-up question and answer period will be equally entertaining and provocative. So at the conclusion, there will be a question and answer period that will last, with help, as long as yesterday's. I want to emphasize that students are going to be called on first. I know that some of you who are former students would love to participate, my friend Michael for sure, but we're going to hold off on calling on them until after students have all had a chance to engage and be taught something by Justice Cuéllar. So it is my pleasure to introduce him.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all of you for being here. It's just a tremendous honor to be here. I said that yesterday, and I'm going to say it again because it still feels like an amazing, just a humbling honor to be here. I should add that I have vivid memories of when I was taking trial practice, and Professor Wisner was kind of a rock star in that field, so he would just amble about and go from trial practice class to trial practice, just joining the instructors and giving that last tidbit of special wisdom. And one night he came to the class, it was in the evening somewhere in the basement of Yale Law School, and I had been working really, really hard on trying to come up with a persuasive argument for why a particular piece of evidence in a simulation we were doing should not be admitted. And I refined my arguments, and I felt confident, and the instructor had been emphasizing the importance of speaking with confidence. So Professor Wisner came in, and the instructor said, well, Steve, why don't you serve as a judge and hear the arguments back and forth? And I said, this is my chance. So I launched into this carefully worded, confident but not overbearing argument about why this was hearsay and it shouldn't come in, and if it was, why no exception to the hearsay rule applied. And ultimately I said, and even if you don't agree with me about that, it's so prejudicial and so on. And then I stopped, and there was a total silence in the room. And I looked over, and Professor Wisner had been kind of going like this, and it's just nah, I'd allow it. So, I hope I can do better this time. All right, so 2 years ago, I was invited to a class at Stanford on AI safety to explain why a lawyer like me had been growing increasingly interested in artificial intelligence and what I thought might be useful for students interested in this topic to know about how society generally approaches the problem of regulation. How safe is this product? Can I drink this water without getting sick? What's in the air? And so on. There, I found some students who were pretty engaged and creative. There were about 50, maybe 45 students. Most of them, almost all of them, computer science, many undergrads, but mostly grad students. A couple of students who were technical but not computer science, so aero-astro, mechanical engineering, and so on. I talked about the things you would imagine that somebody with my background would talk about. I talked about how society deals with the collective action problems involving our approach to new technologies like aviation or nuclear. I talked about agency capture. I talked about the role of civil society and spurring government into action. I talked about litigation and how it works. And as part of the discussion, I suggested at one point that in my considered humble experience in government, it was very clear that deep technical knowledge was pretty important to almost anything government did to get it right. So I gave the example of how around environmental protection, whether your concern was more endangered species or climate, it really helped to understand the science. And some of that knowledge ought to live not in contractors, but inside government. So I suggested that students consider working in civil service, nonprofit organizations, civil society, government, running for office. And then I made a kind of an offhand comment like, you don't have to dedicate your whole career to this. Like, here's an analogy, like in law, sometimes people go private sector, but they spend a couple of years doing that. You might even try it for this summer. A student raises his hand and says, Professor, I hate to say this, I'm really sorry, I don't know how this is going to sound, but do you have actually any idea how much money we can make working in the private sector, even just for summer? And there was a silence, much like in this room. My mind was kind of racing. I was fascinated sociologically. I was dismayed. I had that sort of moment where you can see yourself talking just seconds in the future, and almost anything that I could imagine saying sounded awfully preachy. It sounded like how my daughter looks when I start saying something to her that she doesn't like to hear, which fortunately doesn't happen that often, and she starts going like this, right? So I thought about Max Weber's distinction between an ethic of consequence and an ethic of responsibility. I thought about all the difficult technical work to weigh the costs and benefits of policies to govern autonomous vehicles and drones, and how I hope that some of the people in that room would be part of that discussion. But I'm not going to tell you what happened. I'm going to leave you in suspense until tomorrow, at which point I will tell you what happened. Because, you know, I have to give you some reason to show up tomorrow, right? It's very rare I get the chance to give lectures like this, and I have more than one day to do it. But when I think about that exchange today, I can't help but think of a lot of people, technical people and lawyers who are technical people too, making decisions about their careers. In Kaldor, I also think about people who are weighing how they can use their appetite for risk and their time and their effort to make change happen. I think about people in Hong Kong, for example, making judgments, maybe some spur of the moment, just on the fly, but maybe also quite intricate ones. Maybe they even take out a pen like this one and start working out the expected utility. I don't know, but it's a striking thing to imagine when you think about those choices. Lately, as you probably know, the authorities have been using water cannons to spray blue dye, and the dye not only stings, of course, but it, along with facial recognition, it diminishes the possibility that the protesters can do so anonymously, and surely adds urgency to a version of Professor Peter Singer's question about what is the most good that you can do. Speaking of which, in a former Castle lecture, Professor Peter Singer laudably called on us all not only to do good, but to be thoughtful and rigorous about how we might do the most good. And in a way, the conversation I was trying to have with the students in that AI safety class was about that. Doing the most good might be accomplished by giving a part of yourself, as he very eloquently says in his book, through organ donation, sharing some of the copious wealth that a graduate from an institution like this one can amass, dedicating a portion of your career to serving the public. Although Professor Singer's account is grounded in and primarily aimed at debates about how a person can do the most good, you can argue, and I would, that there's a substantial convergence between the ambition of effective altruism and the project of rigorously weighing the costs and the benefits of policies that we take on behalf of the public. As is no doubt the hope of many who believe in effective altruism, this project of weighing the costs and benefits of social action has made an important difference over the last half century or so. In the hands of some practitioners and in response to certain scholarly ideas, in many quarters, the project of weighing consequences, of being a good consequentialist, has grown ever more rigorous in its aspirations, with the goal of being as much quantitative as possible in tallying up costs and benefits within a particular domain, such as a rule governing drones or a policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In some respects, this project has furnished the tools to help us weigh how environmental harms endangered human activity, how they were also engendered to some extent by human activity. Over time, policymakers and courts have tried to sharpen the evaluative saw by requiring analysts to consider not only the merits of a particular action, but also the comparative merits of one action relative to another. And this too fits with what I gather effective altruists aspire to treat as a desirable norm for those trying to weigh the merits not only of doing good or not doing good, but how do you do the most good? My question, mostly motivating the rest of the talk, is this one. What should we make of the many seemingly attractive policies that turn out to be the most good you can't do? By the most good you can't do, I mean, for example, that the ideal policy or altruistic action is something that we can envision or even plan, but either it's not realistic to execute successfully given existing conditions, or it's indeed possible to implement but has undesirable downstream consequences that cut against pursuing that course of action. A rule aggressively expanding the category of employee relative to contractor, not unheard of in California, may be for some evaluators so attractive as to be nearly optimal, but it may require unavailable resources or enforce or engender a backlash, limiting the agency's legal authority. Or a person may find that her most valuable altruistic use is to work with poor children at a local inner city school, but the school in question is run poorly and unlikely to fully support or value the teacher's labor. On a closely related note, sometimes a policy or interpretation that's desirable from one perspective, such as allowing people to recover economic losses in a negligence action arising from a natural calamity such as a gas leak, turns out to be all but impossible to administer. Finally, sometimes a sensible measure addressing a discrete problem, like the health of people who consume a certain kind of food, may exacerbate through political backlash, for instance, the risk of failure to enact a policy or legislation valuable in mitigating the risks of climate change or reducing risks posed by an aging nuclear arsenal, right? These most good you can't do type questions are obviously worth asking in any sensible real world conversation about policy or about altruism, and perhaps in some conversations about legal interpretations where appropriate. But for reasons I'll explain, they raise more cross-cutting and profound issues with the arsenal of analytic strategies and assumptions we routinely use to render the world tractable and safe for consequential evaluation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a few examples that I think will help ground some of what I'm talking about. I'll offer some instances where the traditional approach to weighing costs and benefits, trying to use as much quantification as possible, seem to have served society less than perfectly. Then I'll talk about a few ideas to improve our capacity to assess consequences that also maybe bear some relationship to the conversation we had yesterday about big risks. And then I will end, which is good, because normally I don't talk this long. So let's begin, as so many days do, with eggs. In 2009, I was handling, among other things, the food safety portfolio for the Obama administration, working in the White House Domestic Policy Council, working closely with people in the Agriculture Department and the Food and Drug Administration and Centers for Disease Control. So I worked on the latter stages of a rule that was about to be promulgated by the FDA on egg safety to prevent salmonella. I found the cost-benefit process valuable as it brought more precision to our evaluation of measures to prevent contamination at farms. particularly since some farms were going to get bad news. They were not going to qualify for an exemption that applied to farms that had a small number of hens, relatively small, and they were going to have to expend time, energy, money, doing things that seemed like intrusive from a Washington, D.C. perspective. So in response, for example, to concerns that the industry might call into question the future of what was left of the egg industry in discrete parts of the country, Hawaii being the most prominent example, it was helpful to point to an analysis that the rule was expected to prevent about 79,000 foodborne illnesses a year and to prevent 30 statistical deaths caused by consumption of contaminated eggs. Near the edge of my awareness, but still clear in my mind, if I focused, were the many assumptions that this analysis was built on. Not only about compliance with rodent spotting requirements that were built into the rule, but also about more profound matters. The focus on aggregate welfare, but of discrete individuals, simplified by use of what we in the law world call the Kaldor Hicks criterion, to leave aside where the welfare gains and costs are going to fall, and to focus on aggregate increases in welfare. The aspiration to quantify wherever ever possible the relatively static analytical framework, so we weren't measuring how does the world change over 5 years, 8 years, 10 years of complying with this rule over time. If, for example, norms come from partly the learning that people do in these farms about how to comply, does that change compliance costs over 5 years, 8 years, or whatever? It was clear to me that we tended to rely on this approach, which could be called conventional or neo-orthodox cost-benefit analysis, for a variety of understandable normative and descriptive reasons. Okay? The calculations are more tractable when the world is depicted in simpler terms. Sometimes the statutes themselves that we were implementing limit the breadth of the analysis. The reach of what some might call a kind of neoliberal paradigm in political economy made some of the assumptions not only useful, but seem natural and sensible, like thinking about individuals and individual welfare is quite atomized. Path dependence within organizations reinforces cultural assumptions and personal agendas that encourage the embrace of existing procedures. I could imagine the conversations with OMB, with FDA, if I said, have you thought for a moment about modeling to some extent the diminished welfare of a whole family when somebody gets sick? Are you kidding? Why would I do that? Why isn't this the right way to go about it? What was less clear to me then or now is the extent to which the conversation about any rule should be expected to screen out a variety of prudential questions and critiques of such analyses that are honestly less candidly acknowledged in this process. Could we use new methods to build in subtle features into the analysis, like dynamic changes in industry norms? Assuming the statute leaves some discretion on this front, what's the right timing for the rule given the administration's broader agenda? How might the rule interact with other health-related policies such as negotiation over the Affordable Care Act? If there's a way for the rule to achieve the vast majority of the benefits in a manner that's far easier to administer, but not all the benefits, is it worth making that trade? On a more familiar note, should we relax assumptions that costs and benefits are to be quantified as much as possible and instead routinely seek to preserve a qualitative dimension? It's hard to imagine that the most sensible answer to advancing social welfare across the board is always going to be a resounding no. Even if one has near boundless confidence in the analysis, trying to optimize on issue-specific considerations across every area of the world of scarce administrative capacity and institutional capacity is risky, particularly if there's a legitimate reason to assign special importance to certain cross-cutting goals, like mitigating the risk of climate change or managing our relationship with artificial intelligence. Just as a principled, effective altruist might want to ask whether the strategy she's chosen to do the most good is lawful, treat that as at least one consideration, so might a principled public official considering what to do about the range of all these considerations might also want to know, can I do it in my job? Does this fit with separation of powers? Does the statute let me do it? What I'd suggest is a limited claim, without meaning to dismiss such questions, is simply this. We should take seriously the case for a more capacious and candid consideration of consequences in the many situations where the legal materials are less than clear, or where they clearly permit some discretion, or where policymakers are designing institutional rules in the first place. Not infrequently, considerations involving administrability, institutional capital, broader cross-cutting priorities, already play some role in decision making and are worth acknowledging with more candor. And ignoring such prudential factors or applying the more conventional flavor of cost-benefit methods can conceivably lead to outcomes that serve society's interests less well in the long run by making it harder for policymakers to consider what unquestionably matters to the entire enterprise of governing. Okay, let me go to my next part. All of these arguments might be less compelling to me. I might have more confidence that we should just stick to a simple, straightforward method we kind of know, elaborate on it somewhat incrementally the way some of its advocates might suggest. If the application of this conventional issue-specific cost-benefit analysis had been an unalloyed success, at least in the US and at least with regard to regulation, that picture is more complicated. That's the punchline, and it's probably not surprising to you, right? So sometimes we underweigh benefits and overweigh costs. In other cases, analytical methods such as minimization of exposure based on an endangerment finding, like with lead in gasoline, turns out to become quite popular and later gets cost-benefit justified, but at the time we did it, it would have been hard to do that. And in still other cases, all this cost-benefit stuff is a little orthogonal to the fights about legal interpretation and about policy priorities that end up having the pivotal effect in doing something, like when the EPA finally got around to proceeding on climate change-related regulations. So let me give just a few examples, and this is like the riskiest part of my talk, because whenever I start talking about things like the EPA's regulation of AZM pesticides and stuff like that, like the audience will begin to sort of tune out. So bear with me. The hardest work in putting together this talk was shrinking and shrinking this section, so this is about, as quick as I can make it. In 1978, the EPA issued a ruling to phase out CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. The agency revised its cost estimates of the phase-out as compliance costs fell. Yet the actual phase-out ultimately cost about 30% less than the estimates. The agency, so why was the discrepancy there? Well, mostly because the agency failed to account for how soon the market would adjust. So it's a variation of the point I was making with the egg safety point, right? Institutions learn. That's in some ways the whole premise behind aspects of neoclassical economics. They respond to incentives, right? That's like not true when it comes to regulatory compliance. But there's very rarely a dynamic element built into these models, and so that CFC regulation was mispriced to a very substantial degree. In terms of underestimating regulatory benefits, the EPA's regulation of the AZM pesticide, I think, shows just one example of the stakes. When the EPA conducted the cost-benefit analysis, it failed to consider the full range of pesticide alternatives, failed to adequately define the level of human harm necessary to trigger pesticide cancellation, failed to account for the underreporting and late emergence of pesticide-related illnesses. So in the end, a perfectly understandable effort to make the world more easy to model gave us a very inaccurate sense of what this was actually going to do in the world. Sometimes less than adequate analyses were associated with policies that made some important contributions in the long run. So here, it's 1973, the EPA decides it's going to move forward with an endangerment finding of lead in gasoline. But the logic behind that's very different from the way we aspire to do CBA now. It wasn't like at every dosage, what's the impact and when do the sort of lines of cost and benefit cross? Instead, it was sort of like, lead is not great. Let's try to limit the exposure to this as much as we can, in effect. So now we know a lot more about the health effects that come from lead, such as reduced learning capacity, neurological disorders, high blood pressure. And these would have been quite difficult to disentangle from other causes back then, given that if you're maximally rigorous, disentangling causation is kind of like the hardest thing in social sciences. So like, what room do you give regulators to say, we know enough to go forward, and let's learn more as we go along? I would say you can tell a similar story about OSHA's 1974 rule limiting workplace exposure for vinyl chloride. I don't mean to rag on the 1970s. I was born in the 1970s, but a lot of these things did not work perfectly then. They still don't work perfectly. And then I just want to say a little bit about the remarkable story of how the EPA came to decide that, or be forced to decide, that it ought to take climate change and limiting greenhouse gas emissions seriously. And here, my main point is simply to note that anyone who thinks that sort of evidence data and the right cost-benefit analysis is sort of the right way to go ought to grapple with the fact that sometimes crucial moves in policymaking and in law happen for a different reason. They happen based on legal interpretations and who wins elections. And there's more nuance there. You could say, well, why don't we make that more sort of like responsive to the right kind of cost-benefit analysis. But for what it's worth, the EPA realized some years after the Clean Air Act was enacted, so in 1998, that there was a very plausible interpretation of the Clean Air Act that justified greenhouse gas emissions regulation. And by the time the EPA got around to issuing proposed rules and getting comments, responding to petitions, a new administration had come in deciding that actually that legal interpretation was sort of wrong, didn't believe it, and the EPA pulled back. The litigation that ensued ended up before the US Supreme Court, and finally the US Supreme Court decided that no, it wasn't sort of like a weighing of costs and benefits as such. It was simply that the way the statute was written, if the EPA had jurisdiction over this, and it had a petition that it hadn't adequately responded to saying you should then deal with human impacts of this, the EPA had a responsibility to do it. To this day, I think that's perhaps the most consequential environmental law decision from the US Supreme Court. So all this to me suggests that we can do better, right? I'm not saying that I would like to do without any CBA, but it's like a not solved problem. And just how technical, precise, and rigorous we can make it without losing some of the nuances is a hard question. And here I just want to pivot back for a moment to the effective altruism stuff, because in a way, I'm plainly sympathetic for the idea that we can all be more reflective about how we think about the opportunity cost of the altruism we do. But there is a weak claim and a stronger version of the claim worth disentangling. And the weak claim is that society can be more systematic in assessing what's good, that is worth doing, perhaps disentangling the pathos of persuasion or emotion that generally galvanizes action from the logos of why exactly we believe one path is better than another. This insight scales, you could say, from individuals to organizations like private philanthropic foundations or even governments, which is one reason why some attention to effective altruism, I think, belongs in a discussion of how government weighs costs and benefits. Even this weak claim, I think, is important in emphasizing some of the different ways that people can make reasonable, positive differences in the world, not just going by the instinct of showing up in a refugee camp and becoming an aid worker, but maybe by earning plenty of money and donating a lot of that money. But that's the weaker claim. The stronger claim captures a deeper ambition that I think is more similar to what motivates the most enthusiastic proponents of hardcore quantified cost-benefit analysis in government. And that's that we can design a relatively reliable metric for ranking possible altruistic actions, and that we can expect it to serve as a sufficiently compelling guide to individual and institutional priorities that it should trump, no pun intended, other considerations, such as how much you love to do something, or whether you think it will inspire other people. To this stronger claim, I think the right answer is deep skepticism. For one, human social life, as we've seen, is incredibly complicated. Tipping points and interdependent utility means a far from obviously good, seemingly wasteful act of altruism can greatly impact meaningful changes in the probability of achieving societal goals. Somebody protesting around the world in Hong Kong can inspire somebody in California to try to push for better language access for litigants in California courts. For another, the many attractive philanthropic or altruistic options are less viable in a second-best world, the point I started with. The ideal of applying rigor isn't the same thing as the hubris of expecting a single viable metric to serve as the deciding factor in a conversation about the myriad ways that some individual can pursue noble ends, and the many ways those pursuits can fall short of their goals. So let me turn to envisioning what I might call a more thoughtful conversation about these topics. So I would paint a more complicated picture where there's room to draw certain lines with greater precision in the analysis of costs and benefits, but there's also room to interpret blurrier divides and intricate splotches of color that inevitably sometimes evoke something like a Rorschach test. Better to embrace the challenges with humility, and to do that, I think we should start by moving beyond the but we should start by thinking about what it might mean to move beyond the evaluation of isolated policy or altruistic silos. Consider again the typical application of cost-benefit analysis. We take isolated policy problems and presume to work out the most sensible policy response, holding the rest of the world constant. I imagine this is what some practitioners of effective altruism would hope to do as well. Yet nearly any sensible inference about the consequences of a policy depend on a series of assumptions about the rest of law, society, politics, and economics. That frustration with a new rule won't undermine the viability of another valuable rule or policy, for instance, or that it won't create regulatory disparities in safety or cost in the event that other regulatory domains face a more treacherous political economy. Years and years ago, Mark Hellman made a somewhat analogous point with respect to the evaluation of the costs and benefits of legal rules in the common law. He emphasized wealth effects to explain why marginal analysis of property entitlement rules was questionable. And this is what he said. It is simply unclear why we treat any rule as marginal rather than recognizing that we must simultaneously assign all entitlements if the regime as a whole is to be efficient. If it's not the case that there are only trivial wealth effects from the assignment of all entitlements, it's unclear why we can ignore the general wealth effects of entitlements by assuming that we have correctly set all other entitlements except the one we're discussing. I think basically that's the same point that I'm making with some nuanced distinctions, indeed. So in the egg safety context, if you don't think about those other effects, it's not at all obvious that you can claim that this is cost-benefit justified. Now obviously shaping domain across lots and lots of policy areas is really hard and is no easier than expecting all effective altruists to coordinate their behavior simultaneously in order to maximize their impact. What may be more feasible, and to me has a compelling logic behind it, is to work on enhancing capacity to consider the interdependence of various actions, whether by government or by altruists, and where possible, their relationship to the most urgent issues facing society. Bolstering trust in public institutions is often an example of what I'd consider a defensible consideration. Although Judith Shklar's work also poignantly makes the case for distrust as an element of a liberalism of fear, the existence of that very distrust can serve as a productive constraint that public officials would be foolish to ignore. Important civic goals might depend on the extent to which citizens are more likely to comply with costly demands from their governments, for example, to change energy consumption patterns or to engage in military service. Because of this, it's not implausible for policymakers as well as altruists to consider the factors that scholars like Margaret Levy identified in studying the relationship between citizens and their government. We'd want to ask how policy decisions contribute to the perception that government is trustworthy and that other citizens comply and engage in what she called ethical reciprocity. So let me now talk about a related but different point. This is about embracing changes in the paradigm structuring the whole analytical conversation about how we weigh costs and benefits. New paradigms lead to refined thinking. In generally embracing simplifying assumptions to deal with such complexity, many practitioners and scholars are in a position to affect how society weighs costs and benefits, and they've been influenced by a paradigmatic set of ideas about the economy that some might call neoliberalism. And I'm going to just use scare quotes because I know we could probably spend hours discussing exactly what falls into or out of that. So whether it's precisely the right terminology or not, surely the scope of what we consider technically feasible and acceptable cost-benefit analysis will change as we develop refined ideas about the relationship between the macro and the microeconomy, about the interplay between social forces and economic behavior, and about the range of legitimate reactions people may have to changing circumstances. History always delivers, almost always, intriguing insights, even though at the cost of actually living through them sometimes. In the rise of modern cost-benefit analysis in the US and its relationship to some of the ideas that are part of a paradigm like this, Presidents Reagan and Clinton turn out to be pretty pivotal figures, right? Reagan forged a powerful and interesting coalition between factions whose primary interests were economic and some supporters whose primary interests were very different. They were more of a religious, social, and cultural nature. Clinton addressed the decline of a traditional coalition in his party by bringing in a set of ideas that were familiar from what we might call the neoliberalist fold, and by embracing some of the technical approaches to cost-benefit analysis that had been instantiated by the Reagan administration. Against this historical backdrop, the future of applied consequentialism will almost certainly depend on coalition building, stitching together new ideas about how to measure value, and how to model interdependent behavior dynamically with various interests who can see some advantage in embracing more nuanced methods, whether they're most concerned about flows of capital, the dignity of citizens, protection of the planet, or national security. Such coalitions might become more feasible to forge as new possibilities for weighing costs and benefits and drawing up scenarios are emerging as new tools open up for possibilities to understand the economy. Simulations using artificial intelligence, using agent-based modeling, can be used to discover new ways of seeing how policies interact with each other. This creates the potential to ground a new set of ideas about how to model the economy, not just in a more robust view of political economy, but in different practices of model building, more robust connections between science and deliberation. Which brings me to a third point, which I call embracing evaluative pluralism. Our tool for this era has been, in regulation, this weighing of costs and benefits that proceeds in a very particular and predictable way. But in any sensible version of a reformed approach to this, we'd probably analyze discrete problems by considering broader priorities and thinking about the value of having several different estimates or analyses that contend for attention. In fact, I might embrace a rebuttable presumption that important policy actions should be informed by multiple analyses, maybe 3 or 4 of them, that would highlight the distinct assumptions that are being made and reduce the risk that even careful decision makers will rush to embrace a single approach as somehow handed down from the mountain on stone tablets that are beyond question. Sure, sometimes even exponents of applied consequentialism recognize the need for nuance. But I want to just talk a little bit about Professor Cass Sunstein and his voluminous and very impressive body of work to highlight the importance of nuances here and the possibility of taking seriously the weighing of costs and benefits, but not denying the moral and political judgments that are implicit there. So it's kind of worth contrasting, I would argue, Sunstein's work in a piece called The Arithmetic of Arsenic from 2002 with some of the more confident statements made to defend conventional cost-benefit analysis more recently. In 2018, for example, Professor Sunstein said, "The simplest point and the most important was emphasized by some of Reagan's own advisors. Policy should make people's lives better. Officials should not rely on intuitions, interest groups, polls, or dogmas. In a nutshell, quantitative cost-benefit analysis is the best available method for assessing the effects of regulation on social welfare." Contrast that with what Sunstein said in The Arithmetic of Arsenic in 2002. So he takes the EPA to task for how it analyzes an arsenic-related rule to limit exposure to arsenic under the Safe Drinking Water Act. It says, the way they calculated their particular cost-benefit curve and dose response curve is highly contingent. They could have done it in a lot of different ways and still be scientifically accurate. And if you'd done it that way, you would have found that smaller concentrations of arsenic were justified, or rather lower thresholds. And then beyond pointing out these limitations, he emphasized that the ultimate decision still had to rest on political value judgments about the full extent of interest considered and about acceptable levels of risk. To me, this narrative sounds a somewhat more humble note, emphasizing the value of different scenarios and teasing out the implications of distinct assumptions. There's always the argument that the crux of a decision-making process should be kept purely technical, free of original sin, as it were, and then messier considerations about politics or social acceptance or administrability can be brought in at the end if they must come. Because I think there is a risk of poor decision-making or intellectual sophistry from keeping important decisions as anodyne as possible, I want to foreground some of the possibilities for greater candor and bigger picture thinking and weighing consequences without suggesting that we do away entirely with CBA. To channel Judith Shklar, I'll repeat what she says at the end of her terrific book, Ordinary Vices. At most, she says, I'm trying to make our conversations more complete and coherent and to review critically the judgments we ordinarily make and the possibilities we usually see. I would add that in the end, some civic conflict about all these domains I've talked about, how you do the most good, how much arsenic is safe to put in the water, is par for the course and rightly so. Overly suppressing it is hardly a recipe for healthy or legitimate institutions. Being honest about such conflict is just one step, but an important one in doing better on how we decide to decide. So let me end by saying that my principal message tonight is that we can do better. in making decisions that matter. Our problems with climate and nuclear threats showcase how much depends on factors such as economic and political interests, norms, the capacity of institutions to overcome resistance, and the dynamic changes that we experience in all these areas. So I think we're left with at least two recurring problems pointing in somewhat opposite directions. Even if we agreed on what goods are worth prioritizing, identifying the most good you can do without taking into account the messiness of the real world means neglecting whether the good can actually be realized. Yet as the protesters in Hong Kong no doubt realize, sometimes the call to help build a different world can outweigh the legitimate claim that any anodyne expectation of measuring expected utility is going to really have in our behavior. The most good you can't do in that sense is good that you might want to do anyway because it matters to you. But an overly crabbed conception of it, this not only plays down the multiple answers to the most good you can't do question, but it also diminishes our ability to appreciate why there's a reasonableness in the risky action that's playing out in some quarters, including people protesting in authoritarian governments. Maybe it's right for someone to say, I'm not protesting because I'm going to do more good by keeping my high-paying job and donating much of the salary to deworming in Africa. I think some authoritarian governments would welcome that answer. But to assume the kind of calculus, that kind of calculus, I think is, that kind of calculus is likely to be right in the sense that it should scale up to be the dominant answer, cast aside how much empirical, theoretical, and values conflict we should honestly acknowledge in debating the rightness of how we pursue a better life. Thank you. Before I take questions, I should apologize for speaking so quickly. I think today was slower than yesterday, but I still have some work to do. So I'd love to hear your comments and questions.
Students are in the hot seat.
And in law school, we call on people.
This is more clarifying.
Yeah, sure.
Than anything else. Again, thank you so much for speaking here today. So the first problem, as I understand it, is agreeing on goods is not necessarily, that doesn't indicate that the next thing that will happen is that we'll get to that good that is agreed upon. But what is the second problem as you articulated it? I couldn't quite catch it.
So I think what I was trying to get at was, if you question that we've already arrived at a pretty simple and straightforward method to prioritize among actions, then the insight, I think, cuts in two separate directions that are somewhat in tension with each other. One is, let's just focus on doing the most good we can in a sort of logical way and aspire to fulfill the original ambition of cost-benefit analysis or effective altruism, but let's take into account more constraints. And that might make some actions seem less attractive, even though they seemed more attractive before. But I evoke the protesters because I also feel like sometimes, I would feel weird if the upshot of this whole conversation was be more cautious, right? It feels to me like part of what I'm getting at is also that sometimes somebody might say, it's not like the most good I can do in any conventional sense where I can sort of make an expected utility judgment and it's like really the best option from that perspective, but I don't feel like I have a choice and I have to do this. So I feel like there's work to do in both directions. Like maybe there's still some weighing of utility and of strategy, even in the realm where people have done something as a matter of conscience. But there's also a need to be more practical and realistic and politically savvy when we've chosen to do something that is sort of like technically justified. Yes, back here. Definitely a student.
So one of the key parameters in cost-benefit analysis is discount rate. One of the problems with climate change is most of the costs are going to be decades in the future. How in the world do you deal with that?
Oh, that's a great question. So my kids understand discounting very well, as all kids do, right? There's these great experiments you might know about that were done at the Bing Nursery School at Stanford showing how it is that kids struggle when they're told that they'll get extra candy if they wait, and then trying to match up that behavior to a lot of life outcomes later on. I think let me start by saying, like, I think it'd be crazy to totally get rid of discounting, but there are a couple ways in which I think it would be really helpful to be less orthodox about it. So let's start with current preferences people might have that map onto discounting. So I might believe that the right thing to do for society is to counterbalance the natural presentist bias that we have. I don't want to die tomorrow. I want to have, what I need, with actually a policy that does the opposite of discounting, precisely because our politics are already biased. That's, to me, a perfectly sensible, legitimate move in the analysis. And no, it's not true that we can't model that. So then beyond that, there are more complexities, right? There might be other rationales that one might have for having a discount curve that looks kind of funky. But let's just start by opening up the conversation and saying, we are not bereft of tools, either tools for deliberation or tools for technically modeling that really force us into a straitjacket and make this conversation quite so simple ever, right? And then from there, we'll see where we go. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was wonderful. I would love to know how you're thinking about altruism translated across different problems. So you referred to the protesters in Hong Kong, which feels like very individual. We're talking about, I want to do a certain action for whatever values I hold important. How do you think about altruism looking at climate change, for example, where the actions of a lot of good-hearted individuals are not going to address the problem? And the kind of more traditional cost-benefit questions, I don't know if they come more into play or less, but I'm wondering about the role of altruism for you thinking about the problem of climate change, and who's supposed to be being altruistic?
Thank you. It's not an accident that altruism has bedeviled those of us who kind of came up through the ranks academically by being engaged with the idea of rational action, in part, benefiting from paradigms that heavily made use of it, but also at times seeing its tensions and contradictions and limitations. Because, you could certainly imagine somebody who says, I want to be deeply rational, and for me, altruism only is altruism when it does nothing to benefit me, right? And yet, like the conventional, rhetorical case we make for altruism generally has the following structure. Like if I'm giving a speech and I'm exhorting people to volunteer, it will almost always have an element of do good for others. You will also be doing good for yourself. You'll be giving back to, if not you, your community, and that matters to you, whatever. So I don't want to be overly sort of technical and suggest that a complete separation between what only benefits others and what benefits you is desirable in policymaking or making your own choices. But it is helpful to recognize that the concept is useful in part because sometimes people do things that they think are in the public's interest, but they're mostly self-serving, right? So it is helpful to have some way of pushing back and getting people to try to distinguish the interests involved. And climate is a good example. There are justifications for the Belt and Road Initiative and all kinds of other infrastructure projects that have a development angle that might come from a kind of also help save the planet climate change perspective. And it's never been a bad thing to try to unpack the different agendas that people might have that motivate them, so long as it doesn't make us completely cynical, right? I feel like just as it's important to disentangle the interests that one might have that are mostly personal regarding from what good you're actually doing for others, it's also important not to believe that whenever those things converge, that somehow that makes your actions illegitimate. Yeah.
One thing that you spoke about was sort of the importance of embracing sort of evaluative pluralism so that we can have at least governmental actors optimize their ability to see the way that different decisions interact with one another. And I guess I had two questions on this front. First of all, my question is, I guess, how we can do this and how government can act more effectively to do this. And then second of all, whether this is something that you think stands only for governmental actors or just sort of effective altruism at a more individual level.
Definitely at a more individual level too. And Ruth Chang's work, I think, is interesting in trying to sort of develop a set of concepts that help people weigh options, but not do so by trying to seek to convert everything to a common quantitative metric and to suggest that the ideas behind the term something is on a par with something else can do real work to some degree. And expanding from that, I would say, well, whatever methodology you use, whether it's for altruism or for government decision making, it's a wonderful thing if you can develop a capacity to hear from different people who are not unreasonable, how they weigh the merits, right? I think that the hard thing begins to be both in the individual context, but even more so in the governmental context, the decision costs. And they're of two kinds, right? So one is just, it's hard enough and costly to get one analysis done, and for government sometimes that takes 7 years. So now you want 3? Like, Cuéllar, are you crazy? But related to that, not only the cost in terms of resources, but the modal impact of more analysis on government action is less action, right? Just like procedural rights have many benefits, but often the result is everybody becomes a veto player, right? So I think the hard work on the institutional structure side isn't so much to describe the kinds of analyses that one would like to see more of. Like, I think Sunstein does a killer job in the arithmetic of arsenic of describing couple different dose response curves that are all plausible and have different assumptions. And I could imagine working with a gifted user interface designer on the digital side to think about how you present the information digitally to a decision maker, to try to strike an optimal or semi-optimal balance of trust and distrust in these different metrics and to get the assumptions to sort of be highlighted. The harder thing is then to ask, well, how do we make a system like that work in a way that doesn't paralyze us? But I'm pretty confident we can do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is somewhat related, but in talking about sort of like expanding the factors that we take into consideration in cost-benefit analysis, you talk about what are the effects, like if you think about like siloing a CVA within the EPA, for instance, maybe you're not considering what sort of impacts that might have on housing, for instance, and it seems logical that, of course, that would get considered, but maybe you've run the analysis and you think you've consulted every possible agency that you needed to make sure this analysis is good, and then somebody comes at the 11th hour and is like, wait, you forgot to like think about X or Y or Z, and then you've got to incorporate that again. And it seems like that you might lose a little bit of specialty in sort of like calling for so much like cross analysis of sorts. You could imagine that you just have one big central group that just like does all this work, and suddenly you don't have all these different agency heads that is traditionally defined the executive branch, but instead you've just got one large agency that looks at everything and handles everything. And whether that's plausible or not, I think that has certain ramifications that people might find unsettling.
You've really nicely put your finger on how a core idea and tension in my whole discussion is the role of specialization. So I have a couple things to say about that, but let me just first note that one way to interpret your comment is actually to say, you've just provided a pretty accurate description of how the US government, however imperfectly, does this stuff. Because essentially the way it works out day in, day out is the agencies have a degree of specialization. They essentially work on the first draft of one of these analyses. Then it goes to a cadre of generalists at the Office of Management and Budget who debate and discuss with them. And that deliberation, like if I wanted to tell a very positive story about CBA, I would highlight that tension between the experts that did it in the agency and the generalists who are kind of pushing back on fairly technical things. And that's one way we sort of get at these multiple analyses. But I would say underlying that whole effort is still the idea, the fiction, I would say, that you can collapse this all into the one right analysis in some sense. But if you vary that and then you take seriously the possibility of different analyses, then that foregrounds a little bit more the fact that, as Steve Breyer actually nicely put it in a book called Breaking the Vicious Cycle, or Circle, Breaking the Vicious Circle or Cycle? Circle, I think, that he wrote before going on the bench, that expertise has always been a two-edged sword. It's always been both blinding to the way common sense is applied and the way other people think through problems, but it's been a stupendous tool to solve problems. I'm looking for ways to titrate that in different ways to try to get at different problems. And in the effective altruism context, one way that this comes up is, I think for effective altruists, it's a little under-theorized. What I do if I've specialized in refugee protection, for example, and not only because of path dependent, like I happen to take some courses at it at Yale Law School and whatever, but because I actually feel like my personality makes me really, really well suited to the mix of social work and disaster response that entails. But what if it turns out that my own judgment, and it turns out to be nothing but my self-regarding preferences, and an AI system judges me to actually be more useful as an investment banker, I mean, to just make it extreme, but more useful as a social worker working in New Haven. And how do you think about all that extra knowledge I've already gained if it's not like totally enhancing my ability to deliver value? So I would like to live in a world where people can make use of that and have a preference over it, but in both contexts, that the specialists are forced systematically to tangle with people whose special value comes from not being specialists, just like judges generally are generalists. Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear how you think your expertise influences the way you see this and the way you formulate your argument. Because at the risk of sounding kind of comically circular myself, it seems as though like the first lecture was there are these big issues that we're worried about, right? Nuclear proliferation, climate change, this whole host of issues. And it seems a little bit though as though you're performing cost-benefit analysis on ways to perform cost-benefit analysis, right? If you look this way, you're then you get these trade-offs, and if you think of it this way, you get these trade-offs. So what are kind of those root assumptions, those root
Thank you.
practices that you're using?
I'll try to talk more a little about that tomorrow, so a couple thoughts. There's a line somewhere in there that I didn't say in exactly the terms I had written it down, but I'll try to reconstruct it right now. I worry that there is a little bit of a circularity in a piece of my analysis, and I want to own that. But I think the circularity is not only because of me. I think it's actually a deeper feature of the world, and kind of goes a little bit like this. So suppose that I like the idea of cost-benefit analysis, but I'm also making a play for not only prudential judgments about politics, but more candor about the fact that different values are important to people in different ways. So I want those values to be taken seriously. Not all values might count the same for me, right? But how do I pick among those values without using something like cost-benefit analysis? So, to put it in slightly different terms, you could say there's a kind of weak perfectionism that's built into almost any coherent cost-benefit analysis. But I worry that that sort of collapses a little into a discussion of, well, what values are more, good. So I feel like as a temporary move, while we figure that out as a civilization, it's at least better to be candid about where the moves are being made that are driving the analysis. Particularly at a time when it's sort of ironic. I feel like one of the background things that's happening in a discussion about this is, I think the world is growing more polarized. This is my stylized depiction of it. Others might have a slightly different view of it, but I feel like among people who are highly educated, who are in the knowledge professions, there's an increasing embrace of the idea that highly technical methods can offer us the answer, science, etc. And among many, many others, there's an increasing rejection of that. So I feel like that polarization is a challenge that we're facing. And at a minimum, I want some acknowledgement among the people who are most faithful in the technical and the scientific of the different ways that people fundamentally see the world and why that belongs somewhere in our politics. But I'm still struggling with this. Yeah?
How do you think that kind of culture of cost-benefit analysis and policymaking can be changed? Like, are people really married to this approach right now, and how can that be altered?
I think people have long seen it as a way of building coalitions to some extent. This is partly my point about Clinton especially. Among people who might otherwise disagree about things, like, look, it's not that your values are right or mine are right, it's that, it's an empirical question. Let's get the scientists in here and settle it, and let's depoliticize this as much as possible. Why don't we agree on the scientists that should be on the panel? And, woe be it for anyone to dismiss the extraordinary role that scientific thinking generally has played in advancing human civilization. And I'm being a little loose in how sometimes I use technical, sometimes I use science, sometimes I use technocratic. But the general idea that technical knowledge can be politicized is very attractive. I worry that has not, we've sort of taken that as far as we can, and now we're suffering from having gone too far in that direction. And questions about the timing of when you impose a particular regulatory or policy change as people struggle to get used to these norms, get really difficult, especially once you touch anything that's sort of social or cultural, like issues involving LGBT rights, for example. So there's some need for some very careful thinking, but at a minimum, I think step one is don't throw out all this technique, but don't expect so much of it, because if we expect too much of it, we're not going to get either the full benefit of it, nor are we going to get the goal that we want, which is to govern in a sensible way. Okay?
Yeah, can you speak to a sort of tension between using sort of your evaluative pluralism and enacting it in cases where counterparties aren't using the same stringent, thorough, or maybe any evaluative techniques, right? So I'm thinking particularly of like the government right now, right? In particular legislatures, which are legislating ways that they can have more power, whether through gerrymandering, their own party, which reduces the dialogue for the benefit of putting forward whatever policy their side thinks is right. And sort of, you know, how does this idea map onto the sort of counter incentives of reducing discussion and just pushing things through?
I think that's great. And in a way, I want to connect it to the previous question, because one answer would have been, right, like, well, we get people to embrace more and more that there are certain Enlightenment values that help us, right, solve like arbiter disputes. And they are mostly of a certain kind, and they depend on expertise, and that's actually served us well. And like, do you really want to walk away from that? I would say I'm looking for a set of shared values that are necessary for common conversation in any self-governing entity I can imagine, certainly including in America, in North Carolina, in California, et cetera. And I have not believed that the only set of common values that would enable that conversation are science and technical analysis, right? They are one, and they're an important one. But let's take human dignity as one. Like, I think it should bother all Americans that some Americans don't live with dignity. You know, what they do about it might depend on any number of things, but some degree of common concern or some degree for of engagement in like what the proper norms are for a political conversation or for a set of political institutions to operate fairly is key, right? And I've written a little bit about, you know, how when there are stresses on this, there are all kinds of consequences and difficulties, and why it's difficult to put that back together again. But I guess, you know, it's always been worrisome to me to think that the display of authority that is involved in deploying technical knowledge in a way that takes human needs that are asserted in a proper and respectful way and puts them aside, I feel that is sort of concerning, right? So I think where that leaves me as a good administrative law person that I sort of am in my heart is thinking of the scientific and the technical as one of several kind of streams that have to be grounded in norms of political conversation, others being that we care about democracy, that we care about adjudicatory fairness, for example, and then the difficulty is in designing institutions that can take all of that seriously. But we have done that. Like, if you think about, so let me put this in very academic terms so it doesn't sound like I'm just like issuing an opinion, you know, as a public official. But so one thing I take away from the work of Daniel Carpenter, who's, you know, a political scientist whose work I admire, is an effort to blur the distinction between a good organizational politician and a good scientific and technical thinker. And his argument is that if you look at a really effective FDA commissioner, there's somebody who can count votes in the legislature, who can read the journals, who can understand those response curves, who can figure out like what's driving the White House's anxiety about this announcement tomorrow, and is like trying to build around her or him a group of people who are going to be the shock absorbers who take that and process it in some way. I mean, that again is maybe a way of also responding to the circularity point, to sort of own that circularity and to be able to be accountable for it. And in the choices of how you then justify your agency's actions, you're partly contributing to the democratic conversation. Bob, and then Francis.
I guess I have a question about who the addressee of the lectures. I completely applaud the idea of making cost-benefit analysis more open and more responsive to the many factors that it excludes. But if I'm thinking about the greatest threat now to administration, it's politicalization and the need for administrators to insulate themselves for what is increasingly a politicized forms of control which are not subject to the kind of democratic dialogue you're describing because of conditions of polarization. So paradoxically, if I think of my ideal administrator, they do what you'd say. But on the other hand, they develop cost-benefit analysis precisely to insulate from political control. And if I think of the need now for administrators, mostly it's to insulate from a certain kind of political control. And so that raises the question of whom exactly are you talking to?
Thank you. Terrific question. My main audience are undergraduates who are interested in either effective altruism or the role of science, because I feel like this is a generation-long struggle and effort, and it will continue. I mean, more than a generation. But in a way, I'm hoping to abstract a little bit from the moment, important though it is, and smooth, right? And when I think about the risks, I would situate some risks in politicization, some risks in politics, right? In what politics prevails or doesn't. Some risks in a failure to acknowledge the distributional, maybe political implications of technical decisions, right? And all of that together then paints a more complicated picture that I hope our undergrads have enough time to solve, because we won't completely. But I mean, that's another way of saying elections have consequences, for example. Like, so in terms that will be familiar to you, I would say, and many others perhaps, I would say one thing that Scalia, the late Justice Antonin Scalia, figured out, I think, in a way that, to his credit, I would say, is that the best justification for having an administrative bureaucracy that could be about science to some extent, but also necessarily about politics and about law, was never purely expertise, right? I think he came to understand the limitations in that for a number of reasons. Like, expertise can be good, but it fails at times. It also is not always legitimate, right? So it had to be situated somewhere else. And I think in some ways he situated it in the structural politics that allowed some room for democracy. Like, I don't know if he ever used that combination of words, but when he was still a fan of Chevron, he was sort of saying, like, look, administrators are not completely under the thumb of a president, but there's some political accountability there, right? Within limits, right? So in some ways, we're left to figure out, well, how do you impose those limits enough so that you have guardrails and don't go off the rails? Francis.
I think you're still being somewhat enigmatic about politics in a way that I imagine you're going to elaborate tomorrow. But, Robert was talking about what Dan Carpenter was talking about. How do you try to navigate a unpleasant political structure to do the best you can? And you were saying, well, the political structure may be really difficult to maneuver, especially if you have safe seats and the importance of extreme interests for people who are facing primaries in safe seats. That is safe for the party but not safe for the incumbent. And if we have more of those, the political pressures become more anti-democratic in a sense, that the influence of extreme interests become amplified. So I'm wondering what you think about the structures you mentioned, and how do we try to push back on some of those negative features of the structure itself?
There are several puzzles and difficulties in giving a good response. So let me start by acknowledging that in the moment, some of the action space for a principled civic actor surely has to depend on norms, right? And if they've declined, then there's a natural process of like, oh, trust but verify, like, no unilateral disarmament here, like if I'm of a different party and they acted this way, I'm going to act this way, and then you get a kind of escalation. So I certainly wouldn't want concern for the long-term norms to be completely disempowering to people who need to compete with each other if there's going to be some possibility for norms to develop in a certain way. But that's only a piece of it. I would say another way that your good question relates to your previous question, Laxa Veritas. What is your name?
I'm Saul.
Saul, okay. I will say I have a little riff in the talk tomorrow, which I'll just anticipate, where I talk about a concept I call civic judgment, which is I'm trying to give a name and draw a box around political savvy that is not deployed primarily for self-serving ends and takes account of norms and constraints. And I'm trying to do that because I think the word politics has been so loaded with different meanings. So like politicized is a kind of reference to politics that is very negative in connotation. Partisan politics is one thing. But if somebody were to ask me, is a multi-member court political? As a social scientist, I'd say, well, of course. Like, people count votes, and they think about each other, and they are in, reciprocal contact with each other. But if they asked me in a somewhat different context, is a court political? And I felt like they meant partisan, I would say no. Well, we aspire not to be, and I don't think we are, right? And we try hard not to be. We try hard for it not to matter, whether someone's a Republican or a Democrat or none of the above when they, argue a case before us. But I am trying to make space in all these talks for a kind of judgment that I will call civic judgment that is aware of the context of things. And it does feel to me like that is compatible with a medium to long-term effort to build institutions and build coalitions, but it's also compatible with being savvy about how not to be left out of the conversation now. Yeah.
So to follow up, or maybe pile on, this is fascinating talk. I'm really looking forward to the book. So as I understand your recommendations, among them are for more sophisticated kinds of cost-benefit analysis that are going to take account both of the externalities of evaluating one policy for other policy domains and dynamic modeling of effects over time in the playing out over time of compliance or whatever, or failure to comply. What I'm wondering about in relation to these last few questions is whether and to what degree that might play right into the hands of the sort of capture Francis is talking about by extreme interest. So, for example, in a George W. Bush administration, the first George W. Bush administration, there was this big fight about scoring tax bills and over dynamic versus non-dynamic scoring of tax bills. And it was, they were trying to do it through the reconciliation process, and so that math had to add up over a 10-year window and all of that. And so the administration were all pushing for dynamic scoring, and they were saying, you can't just, you've got to look at the, but it was all basically a proxy for fuzzy math, as somebody once said, right? And so, and the bureaucrats won that battle then, but they've since lost that battle. And now, the 2017 tax bill, we had dynamic scoring with fuzzy math being a euphemism for what was put into the dynamic models. So I guess my question is, if you're pushing for a world in which there's going to be a lot more scope for much more complex speculative theorizing about the effects of any given policy, aren't you also going to be pushing for a world in which there's much more potential to capture apparently technical analysis for flagrantly extreme partisan ends?
There's some risk of that. And what's more, I'll even go one step further in suggesting that a critique that would push me, and maybe rightly so, is to say, well, you're actually trying to even allow for some weighing of costs and benefits to include like the political backlash, right? And think of what an unprincipled administration could do with that if they were actually able to cite that as an appropriate concern. I guess my answer would start by saying, my hope in a nutshell about CBA is to ask more of it and expect less from it. To push it to be a more candid assessment of what it is that ought to matter for society, and not to rely on the sort of circa 1970s tools that we had at the time. But also to not elevated in our discourse or in our institutions to a quite as central role as the sort of fundamental technique that is going to arbiter what actually happens. Not that it ever completely has been, right? But sometimes there's an ambition to put it there. So that would then leave me in a place where I'd acknowledge that a potential cost of my own inclination is that the dynamic scoring thing would have gone through, because that's very simpatico with, generally speaking, the direction I'd like to go. But it might have been done poorly, it might have been an excuse. And yet, the practical person in me asks, if we hadn't had dynamic scoring, what would that have done to the tax bill this last time around? I don't think it would have stopped it from passing. And I do think a subtext in everything I'm saying is elections matter. Like, there is a part of this that is really about building coalitions or failing to do so, and that stings. In a democracy, sometimes we face a high cost for the democracy that we believe in when we don't necessarily agree with what follows. I mean, that then pushes us in the direction, well, are the rules of the game fair? So I would say, as it gets closer to questions about are the rules of the game fair, I think that political savvy becomes more important to make sure that this doesn't just become unilateral disarmament, which then further erodes the norms over time.
I think part of my original question was sort of an allegation saying that, in some ways agreeing with you and saying, one of the things we need to bring in is how our decisions impact the rules of the game, right? Seeing decisions to change the filibuster rule, seeing decisions to use gerrymandering, right? And I maybe alleging that there's not been enough credence given to that side of things, and I don't know how you feel about that.
It's complicated. Like, I feel like it's right to weigh the consequences for a system that has as part of its premises that it's supposed to be balanced and fair in the competition for political power. I think it gets tricky because I want government decision makers to be thoughtful about how they can hold together coalitions and not overly diminish people's trust in the entire system. But I also, like probably most of you, don't want those considerations to sometimes, to always outweigh other reasons why you might pursue a policy. So, when writing a book that was partially about Franklin Roosevelt and how he reorganized government, I came across just some evidence that I was never able to fully follow up on. And I think there's probably already a literature on this, although I might have my take on it, which is about how, so part of my argument was that Roosevelt really was key in expanding the operations of the modern White House to sort of what it is now. It wasn't like Reagan or Truman, like it was really the kernel of it was how Roosevelt ran the White House. And there were like decisions about grants that were being funneled to the White House and were being affected by the White House. So like, I hope that my notion of civic judgment is like protecting us from like self-dealing that way. But there is also a kind of political judgment that is about trying to understand how macro policies are having systematically different effects on different parts of the country. And ignoring that has consequences. Bob.
Maybe I'm anticipating too much, but your answers to these questions raise for me the question of how does the administrator think differently than the politician thinks in the modeling that you're doing. So if we expand this notion of civil judgment, it looks like a statesman. And then how do you imagine politicians thinking if that's how the...
I want the politician to be more like an administrator, but never completely to collapse the distinction. And you could say, certainly relative to the conception of an administrator that Professor Sunstein might have, I'd want the administrator to be more like a politician, right? So I'd want them to be closer together, but not the same. And I would say, yes, so okay. So a politician has a job that allows her to explicitly consider partisan considerations within limits, right? It is okay for an elected official. I don't think it's unstatesmanlike completely to say, I have a project that's going to take 25 years. Like, I may not be in this office for 25 years, but I have that project. So I want my coalition to be viable for that amount of time. So we have to sequence these things. The most socially valuable thing is going to come in 3 years and not right now. The most like coalition building thing is going to come now. I think that's an appropriate kind of set of considerations for a political figure, like a legislator. An administrator has to work somewhat differently and keep a good bit of room in his or her thinking for the purposes and logic and structure of the kind of fiduciary duties that have been turned over to her, so that she is not so much being sort of like focused on her long-term coalition, but about what it will take for the agency to perform its functions effectively over time, which is still about vote counting, still about the budget, still in some ways about how the public views the agency, but a different cast. Yeah?
I'm wondering in hearing this, some of these questions and answers, how much you think that agencies turning things into a technical question actually protects them? And one answer to Robert and some of the other questions would be that everyone knows intuitively that there's some degree of politics involved, and always has been. And they get that it's a bit of a sham, that we've turned it into a technical question. And therefore, you're not actually protecting this agency by pretending that by pretending that it's more technical than it is. So one response may be, yes, it may seem like I am opening up the agency to more politics in a time when politics is messed up. But I actually think that more politics actually will protect the agency.
I love that. So one change.
I don't know if it's right.
No, but it sort of tracks, I think, a change in my own thinking about what is happening when an agency asserts technical expertise. When I first started thinking about this, I thought that it was that you could model it as, so imagine a game and the agency says like, it's a technical question, we're putting our foot down. And then like nature decides whether that actually pays off or not. And there's a risk that the agency's assertion of technical knowledge will actually make the agency sort of be rejected more by the public because the agency's given up an opportunity to sort of sell its package of goals in another way, either by building coalitions with the legislature or by kind of defending this as a popular program that fits with what the administration wants to do. So there's like a risk element, but it generally is a good thing for the agency to do. I now think about this differently as probably driven by the fact that there are two different kinds of assertions of technical knowledge. One kind is to say, members of the public, we hereby declare that we're scientists. Don't bother, we've got it under control. Don't call us, we'll call you. It's fine, like it's all happening, humming in the background. So I would say, what would be a good example of that? Well, maybe the people who run like market operations for the Federal Reserve. Like it's not just that monetary policy is technical, it's the execution of it at some level, like leave us alone. There's another kind of assertion of technical expertise, which is what I think the FDA does more often, which is a subtle appeal to values that the public is concerned with. So if you kind of like really, like if you'd listen to a David Kessler press conference or a Peggy Hamburg press conference or others, they're not talking to scientists primarily. They're talking to public officials and opinion leaders. And they're trying to have an overlap where what they say is not going to be rejected by the scientists, but if you draw the Venn diagram, it's going to be intelligible to others. And in that respect, I think they're more like other public officials, perhaps including judges, where there's some sort of like rhetorical coalition building happening where the technical knowledge is sort of in dialogue with the set of values that the public believes it has a right to have an opinion about, right? So that's a different assertion of technical knowledge, and it's one that forces the agency to be in some dialogue with the public, right? And I got to flesh that out a little bit, but I do think that the subcategory of like asserting technical expertise actually can be disaggregated a bit. But I didn't see that, some years back. Yeah.
So if your approach were adopted, how would that play into the debate about Chevron?
I think that when I was taking administrative law with Professor Jerry Mashar, and I came across one of his articles called Pro-Delegation, Why Administrators Should Make Political Decisions, I was persuaded then that he understood something, or actually that I was learning from him, his understanding that rang true to me, of how it is that administrators were inevitably, if they were going to be technically successful, had to anticipate roadblocks that were right at the intersection of the technical and the political, like not having the right budget, having local officials oppose what you're doing, finding you have a problem with your staff. And his argument was effectively that The problem really isn't that administrators are making political or policy decisions. The problem is if they're not accountable in a way that binds the scope of what they can legitimately do and forces them to give reasons and forces them to be reviewed, right? And if we have those structures in place, then we shouldn't worry so much about them making decisions that have some serious policymaking element. For that reason, I have always found it not surprising that when I teach administrative law, my students tend to come around, including the ones who were initially skeptical of Chevron, to the following general conclusion. They don't completely agree with each other necessarily, whatever judicial opinion they read, but they realize that actually even an administrator that is subject to like intrusive, like de novo review from a court, or that is subject to a legislature that doesn't want the administrator to have any discretion, is going to end up being in some ways needed by the other institutions to arbiter the really hard factual questions, unless we totally reconceive of the legislature and imagine like a bunch of specialists running around in congressional committees actually reviewing what the agency's doing in real time somehow. And that realization, I think, just gives them a more nuanced perspective on these debates. I think they don't think that the question about Chevron is like not important, but they think it's sort of less important than the practicalities of what the norms will allow the administrator to control to some degree.
I think that is a lovely wrap-up for this evening's lecture.
I will just note that in that last answer I said norms and administrators, so maybe that's not a bad thing.
That's great.
Thank you, everybody.